It's my pleasure to welcome you to the third of the three lectures given by Dr. Baum in the series Elizabeth Seton Lectures. I will not, of course, repeat all the good things that have been said about him by way of introduction. I'm sure his lectures themselves speak sufficiently in that regard. I would like, however, very briefly to introduce the topic this afternoon in the form of two quotations. The first originated a long time ago, many years ago, in fact, around the beginning of our century. John D. Rockefeller Sr., you've heard of that name, I assume. John D. Rockefeller Sr. was quoted as saying that the growth of business and of our economic system was merely the survival of the fittest. He went so far as to say that that kind of functioning of the market was merely, and I quote, was merely the working out of a law of nature and in fact a law of God, he said. End of quotation. Last year, the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops issued a statement entitled Ethical Reflections on the Economic Crisis. In that statement, the bishops called for, and I quote, economic policies which realize that the needs of the poor have priority over the wants of the rich, that the rights of the workers are more important than the maximization of profit, that the participation of marginalized groups has precedence over the preservation of the system which excludes them. As Dr. Baum said last night, I believe those are very radical statements, actually. The question is, I guess, boils down to, does ethics have anything to do with economics, with the economy? I will not say any more because that is the topic that Dr. Baum will treat, and so I introduce him to you.
In the lectures which I gave last evening and this morning, I talked about a new movement in the Christian churches, in the Protestant churches, a return of the social gospel. One could examine to what extent this present movement is similar to the social gospel and to what extent it also differs from the social gospel of the last century and the early part of this century. That would be interesting to look at. I don't have the time to do this now. In the Catholic Church, what has taken place is really a significant change and development of what we call Catholic social teaching, a body of teaching that took its shape for the first time with Leo XIII in 1891 in an encyclical Rerum Novarum. In this encyclical, Pope Leo XIII summarized and crystallized and synthesized the thoughts of socially engaged Catholics in Europe, in Germany, in France, in Belgium, in England. He created a new progressive, moderately progressive response to the emerging problems of industrial society. And after Leo XIII, this teaching was handed on, was slightly expanded, reaffirmed by Pius XI and reaffirmed and slightly modified by Pius XII. It looked as though Catholic social teaching remains very much in the same direction, and yet in the late 60s and early 70s, a significant change took place within Catholic social teaching. I talked about this in a previous lecture. We can argue this change is crystallized around the preferential option for the poor. And so I argued that Catholicism, accompanied by equivalent movement in the other Christian churches, has become a more radical critic of Western society, has allied itself in solidarity with the poor and with the oppressed and with the dispossessed peoples of this world, has begun to offer a critique of capitalism and urges people everywhere to stand together in solidarity to create an economic system that serves the needs of people in this world better than what we have at this time. Now today, or this afternoon, I want to deal a little bit more with the question of economics and its relation to ethics. Christians demand that social and economic life assume an ethical character. That is, ethics, moral norms, is not confined to interpersonal relations, the way I relate myself to my neighbors, but ethical norms also touch the institutions in which we live and for which we are responsible. And I don't think I have to go into the biblical basis for this in great detail, because it is quite clear that from the very beginning of Scripture, human collectivities were created on an ethical basis. Now we live in a time, I mentioned this before, we live in a time in which science and technology has become so important that for a growing number of people, science and technology, value-free science and technology, is the privileged approach to truth. Sometimes this is called positivism. Positivism is a movement, an intellectual movement in the social sciences and in the study of the arts that wants to assimilate social science and history and other topics as much as possible to the natural sciences. That is, social sciences here want to be strict sciences. That is, they want to discover the laws operative in human life. They want to discover the laws. They want to demonstrate the laws which they discover. And once they have discovered the laws operative in human society, then they are able to make predictions about what will happen. That is, here the model is the human society is really a machine. In some sense, I can discover the laws according to which it operates. I can make predictions, and I can tinker with the machine so that other results will come about. And therefore, we have then in our universities a strong positivistic mood, and this has created an economic science which says we are really independent of values, independent of ethical reflections. For us, economics is a science. This positivistic mood distinguishes between facts and values, and facts are hard, and they are really what is given, and values are soft, and they are, as it were, added afterwards, and facts are the concern of science, and values is the concerns of poetry and clergymen, of poets and clergymen, and have really very little to do with with public policy and with economic policy. And of course, Christians want to challenge this, and in particular, the mainstream economics argues that the human being acts in predictable ways. That is, there is implicit in any economic system is really a vision of the human being. It isn't as value-free as it presents itself, because implicit is a picture of the human being. And our mainstream economics argues that people will always act in such a way as to improve their economic status. And because they believe this is a basic law of human behavior, they are able to discover laws of our economy, and they are able to make predictions. That is, you can only make predictions because you think there is a constant and repeatable behavior. And this homo economicus, that is, the economic man, is then the presupposition of our mainstream economics. And Christians have objected to this, and they have argued that the human being cannot be defined totally and completely in economic terms. There is, of course, much truth in it that our economic and financial advantages determine the decision that we make, but this is one factor among others, and the others must not be neglected. Now, it is of interest that Marxism is a reaction against the liberal economic tradition. Marxism rejected totally and completely the analysis given by these liberal economists who try to analyze economic behavior in terms of reactions of the individual. Now, what Marxism did, at least in its main form, is to create another economic picture of the human being. And here people are defined in terms of acting in terms of their social and economic advancement, but not on a personal basis, but on a class basis. That is, the view is that people are in fact embedded in economic classes, and therefore, whether they realize it or not, they will act collectively in order to promote their class interest. And therefore, the owners of industry will by necessity act in a certain way to promote their class interests, and the workers and the dependent classes will act, again, whether they know it or not, collectively, so in order to increase their collective self-interest. And so we find that the rejection of the liberal economy leads to a very different kind of economic system, but they have very much in common. That is, liberal economics and this sort of Marxist economics have very much in common, because both of them regard the human being defined purely and simply in economic terms. And therefore both of them are similar in this sense. That is, positivism exists on the left and on the right. And I would want to argue that Christians, along with, of course, many other thinkers and movements, repudiate positivism, whether it is on the left or on the right, and argue that there remains something about the human being that can't be caught in the economic self-definition. Something else is operative in human beings. In fact, Christians would object to any kind of approach to social science that is deterministic. In other words, any deterministic interpretation of the social process, that is, what we do is socially defined by certain factors and there is no way of changing it, history is not open. This kind of social scientific approach would be rejected by Christians because they regard history basically as open. In other words, if I may use the terminology which I used in my lecture this morning, the human being remains subject of history. In other words, there are many, many processes, and many of these processes in history, economic and others, include elements of necessity, and therefore there are indeed very definite economic and social and political trends in society, but ultimately man remains, that is, the human being remains the subject of the historical process, and therefore it ultimately remains the responsibility and the freedom of people to decide about their present and about their future. So when we talked this morning about the human being as the subject of their history, then this was not only addressed against a more conservative religious view that took the world for granted and took society for granted and regarded it as the Christian task that we fit ourselves into a society that is a given. This, after all, was very much the kind of piety that many of us inherited in the churches. There is a given, and that is society. And this Christian virtue is to fit yourself into this society without complaining too much. That is, if it doesn't fit too well, we bear the cross, we offer it up. Basically, with patience, we fit ourselves into the way the world is without complaining too much. And if we suffer with the courage and bravery, then we will be rewarded at some future date. This here man, the human being, is not the subject of history. We've moved then to the sense that we are in fact the subject of history. We are responsible for who we are and who we will be. And this formulation is strong, not only against conservative religious views, it's also strong against positivistic social science on the right and on the left that argues that our life is determined by necessity. This is kind of an introductory statement I wanted to make, that Christians will emphasize that economics and ethics are related. That is, values have to do with policy making. Sometimes economists tell us that if we are not economists ourselves, we have no right to argue with them. I mean, they would be so lucky, I mean, if that was true. I mean, I think that I mean, there are different schools of in economics, and all these schools of economics are connected with a particular social philosophy. And even if we are not economists ourselves, we can study the particular social philosophy associated with that economic system and evaluate very well among economic schools. It seems to me, let me give an example from medicine. I mean, in medicine you have different traditions, and it is quite possible for a person who's not a medical student to say to a medical doctor, you know, your approach to medicine is too biological for me. That is, when you treat people, you only look at the biology. That is, you don't take in other factors, psychological factors, human factors, historical factors, ethnic heritage, and therefore you are too biological in your approach. And I rather have a medical practitioner who has a more holistic approach to healing and who takes in also psychological and personal factors. And it's therefore possible to choose among different traditions of medicine, even without being a medical doctor oneself. And very similar, it is possible to distinguish various schools within economics on the basis of these presuppositions. Let me just give an example of the non-deterministic nature of the economic process. It's an amusing example. It's one taken from the writings of Max Weber, one of the great sociologists who was also a political economist. And in one of his books dealing with the Protestant ethic, that is, with the emerging of a work ethic in Protestant countries. This was not associated originally with Protestantism, but it developed a little later, that Protestantism produced a very activist faith where people involved themselves in work, in the transformation of the world, or at least in the transformation of the environment, and work was very important, and contemplation and celebration became quite secondary. And this particular Max Weber contrasted this with the Catholic tradition, at least in the past in Europe, in the pre-industrial period, where laziness really wasn't a great sin at all, where there were a multiplication of feast days, and where people didn't work on feast days and didn't work on the days of their favorite saints, and when hard work really wasn't recommended so much. And of course Weber says that you can never have a church or religion that favors very hard work in an aristocratic society, because here the ruling class is lazy and doesn't work, and therefore you couldn't have a religion that demands work. Only in a more egalitarian society, when the owners and the rulers also do hard work, can you have a religion that emphasizes work so much. And so the amusing story that Weber tells, or at least I think it's amusing, he probably thought it was quite serious, he tells of research that he did in the Prussian-Polish border, when he studied factories and workers, and he argued there that when a factory owner promised more money for piecework, the Protestant workers worked harder because at the end of the day they would get a bigger paycheck, while the Catholic workers stopped at noon and they said, gee, we got enough for today, and took the afternoon off. In other words, I mean, this is a useful story because it shows you that there's nothing deterministic about the manner in which people act in regard to economic promises. It has to tie into a particular culture, into a particular way of seeing the world. Now, in other words, history remains open. And therefore, culture and ethics have very much to do with the economic system. In the movement I have spoken of, in Catholicism and Protestantism, there has recently been a development of ethical principles to which we are to subject our own society, our own economic system. You find in these books, especially in the Catholic books, the view that if an economic system cannot feed the people, house the people, and clothe the people, something must be wrong with it, because after all, the very purpose of the economy is to do precisely that. and therefore if the system cannot do this, we have to examine to what extent it is inadequate, what are the contradictions in the system. And therefore in the literature which I have used in these lectures, all ecclesiastical literature, papal literature, and episcopal documents. I mean, those of you who weren't here in the previous lectures, the extraordinary thing is that this movement of which I speak has penetrated to the level of the Catholic magisterium, and there are significant documents that deal with these issues, and so I want to turn to these in order to find some of these principles which are used to evaluate the present economic system, and principles which are used to project what our economy could be in the future. The first of these principles I already mentioned several times in this context here. It is the preferential option for the poor. I don't want to go over this again. I want simply to say that the Canadian bishops, in their statement on ethical reflection on the economic crisis of January 1983, make use of this principle. And therefore they say we want to look at the Canadian economy, first of all, from the viewpoint of the unemployed and from the viewpoint of the people who live in poverty. And therefore they argue that the system that we have is not adequate because there are so many unemployed. We need an economy that offers us full employment. And secondly, they argue that the present system leaves too many people, vast numbers of people, below the poverty line, and therefore they argue for a renewal and a possible change in the direction of our economy so that our wealth be distributed more justly. The Canadian bishops in this document and in previous documents lament that at this particular time there is a growing gap between the rich and the poor, meaning the rich and the poor in this country and the rich and the poor in the world, rich countries and poor countries. And the Canadian bishops argue that the present orientation of capitalism is such that the decision-making is slipping into the hands of fewer and fewer people. There is a shrinking elite of powerful people who are involved in the decision-making regarding our economy, and therefore there is a smaller and smaller base for these decisions. And they criticize this because they argue that we are meant to be the subject of our history, and therefore there ought to be more participation in decision-making on the part of people. So this, if you like, is the first principles in the light of which the bishops have examined our society. The second principle, or which I haven't really mentioned yet, and I want to this at this particular moment. This principle is called by the Canadian bishops the value and dignity of labor. I don't want to go into the history of this principle. I want to ask, what do they mean by this? And the Canadian bishops argue that the value and dignity of labor is such that it entitles workers to participate in decisions that affect the work process and affect the use of the products they create. In other words, the dignity and the value of labor is such that it creates an entitlement of workers to participate in decision-making regarding the use of capital and regarding the work process. Now, this is certainly a very radical principle. The immediate, it's derived directly from Pope John Paul II's encyclical on labor, where he affirmed this as a basic principle. If I went back further into papal teaching, for the first time it was really enunciated by Pope Pius XI. The dignity on work, the dignity and value of labor is such that there ought to be a change in the work contract, Pius XI said, a change in the work contract and a change in the direction of greater participation of workers in decision-making, and in decision-making in a twofold manner. First of all, the work process, that is the way work is organized, and secondly, in the way in which that which is produced is being employed. Pius XII later on was very much against this, and he didn't like this at all. In the Catholic Church, sort of debates are very often disguised, and you have to be almost a private detective. I mean, many of these documents are written in Vaticanese. In other words, you have to really You have to really know the lingo before you really grasp what is being said. But when you grasp what is being said, it is most startling and most radical. And here we have then this principle developed in great detail by John Paul II, that workers are entitled to participate in the decisions affecting the work process and affecting the use of the capital they produce. And you see immediately that this criticism, this principle is a critique of capitalism as well as communism. Whatever the early Marx might have dreamt, and whatever socialist movements in the past and in the present have hoped for participation of workers, most certainly in the Eastern European Soviet bloc countries, that is the existing communism, there's no participation of workers in the decisions affecting the work process, nor in the manner in which the fruit of their work is used. That all this is decided by a department of the state bureaucracy. And in capitalism equally. In capitalism there is no sense in which workers are participants in the decisions that affect the work process, nor do workers have any say normally in regard to the manner in which capital which they produce is used. And if you don't believe this, just ask your friends working at a bank teller, or ask your friends working in a factory, and they will give you the answer very quickly. So we have here a very radical principle, which is at one at the same time a critique of communism and of capitalism. And the Canadian bishops argue that this is in fact a principle that must be operative in the economy, otherwise an economic system leads to exploitation. And they argue that if this principle is not observed in an economy, then very gradually workers will be treated like things, like commodities. In other words, they argue that when you run a factory, when you run an institution concerned with production or an office, then you think about resources, and these resources is thinking about things, the raw materials you need, the machinery you need, and you think about things. And there is a great temptation that you begin to think about workers as resources, as workforce, all these impersonal words, and then your reflection about resources and machinery becomes the same as your reflection about workers, and then you make people who are meant to be responsible persons, and you deal with them as though they were commodities and things. And our bishops argue, in keeping with Catholic social teaching, that this is against the dignity and the value of labor, to treat them as things rather than as persons. So we have here the second principle that is operative in the Christian critique of the present economy. I want to mention a third principle that is derived from Pope John Paul II's encyclical on labor, and that is related to the second one. Pope John Paul has his own formulations for this, and this formulation is very strong and almost embarrassing for us, but I've lost my shyness about this, and I will mention it. Pope John Paul, you don't have to talk about it, that people shouldn't find out about it, but he called this principle the priority of labor over capital. I don't think that Pope John Paul will be hired as a speechwriter for Brian Mulroney. That he talks about the priority of labor over capital. And what precisely does Pope John Paul mean by this priority of labor over capital? That is the basic principle of the encyclical. And he argues that capital is basically the storing of labor. That is, capital is basically congealed labor. That is capital, and by capital he means resources, raw materials, and he means machinery, technology, machinery, and he means financial resources, capital. And he argues that all of these are basically the result of labor upon labor. Even raw materials become available for production because people have labored. After all, their coal is not made by people, that is quite correct, it's found in the ground, but we know the hard work that is required to make labor available for production. I just visited the Mines Museum in Glace Bay, and was again overwhelmed by the history of exploitation that has existed really from the 19th century on, in the manner in which coals were made available for production. And was only through a very strong labor movement that there have been significant modifications, and even one can ask the question, how far are we now? So there is natural resources. Capital is labor upon labor. And machinery, again, technology have been produced by people who work with their hands and their fists, and by people who work with their brain, by engineers. And again, technology is labor upon labor. And financial resources, again, is produced by work. And so labor is really congealed work. It is accumulated work. And Pope John Paul II argues, therefore, that capital and labor really are one and the same thing. They belong together. There ought to be unity between capital and labor. And he argued, in fact, there is not a unity between capital and labor, and there is no unity because capital has organized itself against labor. These are his words. He says that capital has organized itself against labor. That is, the use of capital has not served labor, but the use of capital has neglected the needs of labor and has sought the maximization of itself. And therefore he established the principle that will keep the unity of capital and labor, and the principle is the priority of labor over capital. And what does he mean by this? He means by this that it is not really of primary importance who owns capital. And this is how Pope John Paul II is distinguished from Marxism here. I mean, I say a few words about this. It isn't the ownership of capital that is the significant thing. It's the use of capital that counts for Pope John Paul II. In other words, he argues there is private ownership of the means of production, and this could be very good. And there are social ownership, or even national and state ownership of the means of production. They are all possible forms of ownership. But all these forms of ownership are conditional for him. They are conditional on the right use of capital. And the only definitive title to ownership, whether private or social, is that the use of capital serve the needs of labor. And what are these needs of labor? Pope John Paul II gives 3 of them. The first one is to promote the well-being of the workers who work in the industry. Number 2, he says that capital must serve the perfection and development of the technological tools, because unless an industry constantly reviews and renews its technological apparatus, it cannot really remain useful and in activity. And the third use of capital must be to serve the whole of the laboring society. And what does this third principle mean? The third directive mean? Pope John Paul II argues that in modern society, the whole of production is so interconnected that all citizens are in one way or another involved in the production of goods. In other words, we have schools, we have teachers, we have roads, we have people who build roads, we have system of communications. That is, all of society is so interconnected that we cannot look at a single industry by itself. And single industry is only possible because there is a whole society that is training people, that is backing the industry, that is cooperating in transportation and in communication. And therefore, capital must serve. Labor includes then, first of all, serving the people who labor in the industry. Secondly, improving the technology that is being used. And thirdly, must serve the society, the laboring society as a whole. Now, these are extraordinary principles of an economic life, and you can ask the question, this is really quite wild. Who do you think is going to change society in this direction? Is this some kind of new, beautiful dream that is being thought up by Christians? And is there a social bearer of this? Is there an agent in society on whom one can count? Is this simply some new blueprint that is written into the sky, and we pray every day that some saint will come down and put this into practice for us? Or is this rather a social theory that is grounded in a particular historical carrier that could move forward, organize, and eventually exercise pressure and power in society so that these economic principles will be applied? Pope John Paul II, in his encyclical on labor, argues that the dynamic element of modern society, he argues, is the labor movement. He argues that the dynamic element is the labor movement, and he argues that this is true both in Eastern European societies and in the developed societies of the West. The labor movement that is faithful to its vocation is one of the principal bearers of the structural changes that we need in our economy. But he argues, he has an extraordinary formulation for this, he argues that the labor movement must ally itself to other movements in society, to movements by other people who suffer under this society. And therefore he speaks of the solidarity of labor accompanied by the solidarity with labor. That is, laboring people, he argues, must stand in solidarity together to become the bearer of the reconstruction of society, and all those who love justice must be in solidarity with them. Now, of course, I remind you that this papal encyclical was written in the year in which solidarity in Poland appeared to be the social bearer of a significant reform movement within Poland, and there was the great hope that here the labor movement would indeed become the agent for significant social change. And in this particular moment, then the Pope thought he could generalize about Eastern and Western society and argue that in East and West the labor movement, if it understands itself correctly and is joined by all those who love justice and is joined by all those who are oppressed in society, could in fact become a significant agent. And when we read the letters of our Canadian bishops, we find that they have totally taken over this particular concept. The Canadian bishops have written pastoral statements on the economy from 1974 and 75 on. If I may put in a little commercial, I have recently published a little book called Ethics and Economics, which I co-authored with a good friend of mine who is a political economist, Duncan Cameron from the University of Ottawa. And in this tiny little volume, we make available, first of all, the significant pastoral letters written by our bishops, and we have both, he and I, have commentaries on the bishop statement, on the economic, ethical reflections on the economic crisis. And it is quite clear that in these documents, the Canadian bishops argue that the dynamic element of Canadian society can only be a movement of solidarity. And the movement of solidarity must be made up, first of all, of working people, but must be made up of all people who suffer in Canada, of the native peoples, of various immigrant groups, of various non-white groups who suffer from discrimination. It must be made up of all the people who love justice, of whatever class they belong. They have to stand together. And the bishops argue that this movement of solidarity is a movement that is really an ethical achievement. On the one hand, it is based on collective self-interest. People want to improve their own economic situation. People want to improve the conditions of labor so that they are less alienated by their work. So there is collective self-interest involved. But at the same time, there is involved a vision, an alternative vision of society, a new ethical vision of society. And thirdly, there is involved the willingness to make compromises so that all the groups in Canada that suffer oppression and injustice respect one another, and that you are willing to modify your own interests so that we can all walk together and work together for social justice. And in this context, the bishops even raise questions in regard to the existing labor movement and the existing organization of unions. And they ask the question whether it could not be possible that some unions and some labor organizations are exclusively concerned about carving out for themselves the bigger piece of the pie, and that they remain indifferent to the unorganized workers and the unemployed and the elderly and the handicapped and other groups in society that suffer neglect. And therefore the bishops say, should not working organizations rethink their position, and should they not really join the original inspiration of the labor movement to be the bearer, the carrier of significant transformation of society in the direction of greater justice for everyone. And therefore the labor movement that makes itself sensitive to these other minority groups and these other struggles could indeed become the bearer of a significant movement of solidarity. Therefore, the new economic teaching, then, which is proposed by the Canadian bishops, is not some kind of blueprint, idealistic blueprint of something that ought to be, that leaves us waiting for some strong man who will come and put this into place. It is not an idealistic theory, but on the contrary, it is a theory that is connected with the social carrier and therefore involves people into dialogue and eventually into cooperation and into organization. Now, what, after criticizing the present economy and after establishing critical ethical principles in order to evaluate the present economy, you probably have the question, well, what do the Canadian bishops in their writings propose? What alternative proposals do they have? And I don't want to, I have to say at least a few words about this, very few. The Canadian bishops argue that at the moment capitalism is moving in a terrible direction. They argue capitalism has been through two phases, the early phase, then there is the Keynesian phase, the New Deal phase, a more benign phase of capitalism. They analyze what this means, and they argue that at the moment capitalism is moving in a new direction, and they analyze in their writings the change of the structure of capital in this country, and they argue that capitalism is really taking back the unwritten contract with society. At one time it favored full employment, at one time it favored the respect for labor organization, and it favored the welfare legislation. And where we're moving now is away from this. And so what do they propose? Very briefly, they make two proposals that seem to move in opposite directions and balance one another. On the one hand, they argue, in line with Catholic social teaching, that on many levels we need more rational planning. That is, when it comes to resources, when it comes to natural resources and their limitations and their scarcity, when it comes to the production of food, when it comes to the production, when it comes to housing, when it comes to necessities, the market alone is not an appropriate tool for production and distribution. Pope John Paul sort of confirmed this in his speech at Flat Rock, Newfoundland. The market is a very useful instrument in many situations, but for the production of food, planning and guidance is necessary. And therefore there should be consultation, there should be government action, not high-handed, but involving consultation on all levels, in all parts of the country, including labor, including industry, including commerce. There ought to be consultation, but ultimately there ought to be planning around the basic needs that society has and that Canadian society has. This is the one principle, and as you know, planning is a word that has recently is sort of looked down upon. People say that government is very inefficient. Yes, it's very inefficient very often, but so of course is free enterprise inefficient. I mean, after the collapse of the car industries in the United States, I don't really see how big business can say anymore that they're more effective than government is. I mean, there is a great deal of bureaucratic incompetence in government and in private industry, and that we need more efficient administrations everywhere. But planning then is recommended by the bishops in certain parts. But now too, Catholic social teaching has always been terribly afraid of excessive power in the hands of any one group, and therefore any kind of principle of concentration in Catholic teaching is always balanced by a principle of decentralization. Some of you know the kind of old-fashioned Catholic teaching, Pius XI, Pius XII. There were two principles that were sort of opposing one another, but there was the principle of subsidiarity. Stimulate coordination and cooperation and processes so that the many other organizations will help this lower or smaller organization eventually to achieve its own purpose. And one of the principles is the decentralizing one, the other one is a centralizing one. Now, incidentally, the principle of subsidiarity has been taught in Catholic social teaching for generations and generations. It has hardly ever been applied in the Catholic Church itself. But that, of course, is another matter which would need a whole lecture to analyze. But nonetheless, in our social teaching, we've had this kind of doubleness. And therefore, in the present teaching of the Canadian bishops and Pope John Paul II, we find the same kind of doubleness. On the one hand, there is a demand for more planning, for more central planning. And it is demand for more central planning around the basic needs of people, food and clothing and housing, so that in the growing scarcity of resources, all people will be basically looked after. But the corresponding decentralizing principle in the writings of the Canadian bishops is what they call a decentralization of capital. That is, the Canadian bishops argue that it is necessary to break up the enormous power, the enormous corporations. I mean, one could imagine, in the 30s there were all kind of antitrust laws and anti-monopoly laws. Sometimes they had teeth in them, but most of the time they didn't have teeth in them. One could easily imagine legislation that would break up cooperation, and particularly the Canadian bishops argue there ought to be more experiments with worker ownership, regional ownership, community ownership. And that would be the decentralization of capital. That is, people, ordinary people, working people, regions ought to move more deeply into industries. They ought to be collectively responsible for production and make decisions in production. And therefore the Canadian bishops argue that what we need are alternative models for economic development. And the first time you read this, that sounds very far out, very, very far out, and some of my friends were really quite upset by this. And yet, when you look at it more closely, you will find that over the last 20, 30, or 40 years, there in fact exist in the world, in North America, in Europe, and in other parts, enormous numbers of experiments in alternative forms of economic development, in worker ownership, in workers' partnership, in contracts that include participation of workers in decision-making or participation of workers in ownership. There are cooperative movements. There are a whole variety of alternative economic developments in this country, in the United States, in Spain, in Europe. We have not looked at them. The Canadian bishops ask us to look at them and wonder whether this is not the direction in which the Canadian economy should go. Now you say, is government listening to these letters of the Canadian bishops? And the answer is, of course, no. The Canadian bishops do not write these statements for government or for people in power, not at all. The statement of the Canadian bishops are addressed to ordinary Canadians. That is, there is the sense that we must raise the political debate in this country. We must initiate people into a debate about the economy. We must enable our Catholic people, first of all, and then other Canadians, to debate economic issues. We have to remove the kind of taboo from economic debates. That is, sometimes in our society, if you don't approve of a capitalist system, you are looked upon as a kind of naughty boy or naughty girl, and you are regarded as a pinko or as some kind of a Marxist, or there is an attempt then to exclude you from the debate. I mean, that's how power is exercised, through culture. You exclude people from the debate because you taboo a certain topic. And therefore, to be a real Canadian, you have to be in favor of the capitalist system. The Globe and Mail, my favorite newspaper, I suppose, was horrified by the Canadian bishops and horrified by the Pope coming out in their support. And they said in one of the recent editorials, the Globe and Mail said that the Pope and the Canadian bishops are undermining the economic personality of Canadian society. I thought it was a marvelous expression, the economic personality. In other words, the present capitalism belongs to the economic personality of Canadians, and therefore when you are critical, then you really offend us very deeply and we won't talk to you again. And therefore these kind of taboos that have cultural taboos that exist and that prevent us from debating how well our system works and how badly it works should be removed, and the Canadian bishops have done their part to remove this taboo and to raise the level of political and economic discussion. And secondly, I think the purpose of these documents of the Canadian bishops is to eventually to mobilize Canadians, that is to mobilize people, to mobilize and challenge workers and the unemployed, and to mobilize, to challenge and mobilize the native peoples and all other Canadians, be they Christian or non-Christian, be they religious or secular, to mobilize them, to communicate to them a sense that we really could change society if we really wanted to. It seems to me quite unpractical to ask government to make many changes, because government hasn't received a mandate to make these changes. Canadians really don't want any change in the present order. You just look at elections that take place. The majority of Canadians don't want any changes, and therefore government surely can't be asked to make these changes. In a democracy, government can only act out of a mandate. And therefore the first political action, if you like, is not political organization in the kind of political party sense. I mean, this may also be very useful, but it's first of all a kind of mobilization of public opinion, of introducing these thoughts into the educational stream. Now, in some Catholic schools, Catholic social teaching isn't being taught. You wonder what kind of a Catholic school that is. In Ontario, again, the Catholic teachers had a meeting a few months ago in Ottawa, and they voted to repudiate the statement of the Canadian bishops on ethical reflection. And therefore they don't want Catholic social teaching to be taught in Catholic schools, and therefore the biggest opposition to Catholic social teaching, I suppose, are Catholics. And therefore I think it is enormously important at least to begin in minorities. That is, we have to have small groups in every city, in every parish, in every town, in every village. We have to organize around groups. We have to create networks of small groups in which people study these documents, collectively reflect on the existing order, ask the question that the bishops ask, and then really try to use their intelligence to see what can we do, what could be done, what could be different. And sometimes local communities can change things. I mean, in England at the moment, there's all kinds of creativity possible in England. At the moment, there is a phenomenon called municipal socialism, where you have a government that is extremely conservative isn't the word, extremely reactionary, and therefore nothing really, there is no help given to people. But in some regions of England, in some towns, in some villages, in some cities, the people in charge of that municipality say, well, maybe the government would help us, but maybe we can do something together. Maybe we can sit around in groups and ask, what are our resources? What's available to us? What is a possible industry we would create? What's a possible market on it? What do we need? Are there resources? Are there intelligence? Are there skills available to us? Maybe by ourselves we could really create something that would deal with our needs, and then we, independently of government, we could activate some of these principles of solidarity and experiment with alternative models of economic development. And therefore, I want to argue then the bishop's statement and the Catholic social teaching, paralleled as it is by the social teaching of the United Church of Canada and of the other Christian churches to a considerable extent, is not addressed to government, it's addressed to Catholics, it's addressed to all Canadians. And it really it invites us to involve ourselves in whatever small way in the formation of groups, in creation of networks, in raising the debate and involving ourselves in possibilities in our own communities to raise consciousness and to experiment with cooperatives and with other movements in order to increase the participation and responsibility of people for their own future. Again, we return to the basic theme of the second lecture, that we are meant to be the subjects of our own history, that ultimately we as human beings, we as Canadians, we as citizens, we as humanity are responsible for who we are and who we will be. And until now we've had political and religious traditions that made us passive, that made us expect that these things will be settled for us. And at the moment we have the great fortune of living in churches and Christian churches that awaken in us the sense that we are to be subjects, and that reveal to us the good news that God is operative in our hearts and in our minds, empowering us to become subjects. And then we ask ourselves, what does this mean to us in Canada? What does this mean to us as teachers? What does it mean to us as social workers? What does this mean to us as business people? What does it mean to us as workers? What does it mean to us as nurses? What does this mean to us in the situation where we are, in our parish, in our religious institution? If we can't, it is not likely that we can change our entire parish, but at least we might be able to start a group in the parish of people concerned with social justice. And we read the Bible together and hear in it God's word addressing us and summoning us to justice. And we read together the teaching of the Canadian bishops and ask what this could mean to us. And we ask what is really wrong in our community and organize on the small scale, first of all, in order to do something about it. And then we create networks. And only in this gradual way, I call this in my writing the minority strategy. It's a minority strategy. It's a network strategy. Only in this gradual way can we eventually reach out to people on a larger scale, and who knows, touch a majority of people in Canada. And once the majority of people in Canada wants a more just society, there are political processes for performing such a transformation. Thank you. Now we have some time. Some of you may want to leave. Others of you may wish to stay. And if you wish to stay, I'm very happy to entertain either questions or difficulties or objections, and I will try my best to deal with them. Yes, who wants to begin? Yes. I'm not sure whether this microphone works. You try it. It'd be very nice if it works.
I'll try it. Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Baum. This is only a little off topic because it relates to Catholic social teaching and social justice in general. You mentioned last night about us belonging to a church that can change her mind. She seems, however, only willing to change her mind when she's put into a corner. A few examples from last night and today are the encyclical by Pope Pius XI in 1931 against ecumenism, and again in 1948 forbidding membership in the World Council of Churches. Okay, that's better. These, as well as stances on the ethical quality of the economic system, have changed. Do you think that only the fact of the diminishing number of and the advancing median age of priests worldwide will end the exclusion of women from the priesthood?
Yes. You know, I'm a feminist. You know, I mean, I think it's an ethical issue, I suppose, whether you should support the church because it favors certain important social goals, or whether you should criticize the church because it doesn't live up to certain social goals. And so I have some friends, some women friends, who feel so offended by the lack of response on the part of the Catholic Church to the women's movement, that they feel they can't involve themselves behind the Church even when the Church speaks for peace against nuclear weapons and criticizes our economy. For them, the great priority is the women's movement, and therefore they choose not to wrestle with the Church at this time because they feel the women's movement is the important cause that they have embraced. While other friends of mine, men and women, argue that indeed the women's movement is important, but at the moment the major threats to our existence of men and women are two factors, namely, first of all, the nuclear arms race, and secondly, economic empire and ideology. I developed some of this at greater length this morning. And at the moment when the Catholic Church and the other Christian churches, but we're talking about the Catholic Church now, at the moment the Catholic Church is really turning against these principal threats to our survival, the nuclear weapons race, and the criticism of the two superpowers, and the critique of ideology, and the critique of capitalism, and the identification and solidarity with the poor, the third world people who are struggling for justice, at this particular moment, they say, we are with the Church and behind the Church, and we hope there will be changes in other areas, but we really back the Church at this particular time. I think these are two options, and every person, I suppose, every Christian, every Catholic has to think about and judge accordingly. For me, am at the moment, I'm very much behind the Church's Pope and bishops because I think something miraculous has taken place, and that is the Church has really diagnosed the principal enemy of the human race at this moment, the factors that threatens our survival. And so I'm very proud to be a Catholic, and I'm very proud that we have progressive bishops and we have a Pope who is really on this issue extremely far-seeing. I regret, of course, that on a number of other issues, the woman issue is one of them, the Catholic Church is not as responsive as I would wish it was to the aspirations of women and to the aspirations of other groups. However, I am on the whole optimistic. I mean, if 20 years ago we thought the Catholic Church couldn't change at all, we thought it was really a kind of a dead whale in the water which didn't move anymore. And then suddenly, 20 years ago, it began to move and made all kinds of waves, and you have marvelous confusion all over. And we suddenly realized that the Church can really change, and if the Church can change, if the Catholic Church can change, then every institution in this world can change. And therefore, I would be rather optimistic in regard to the women's movement, and even if the present pontiff hasn't given many signals that he favors this, and some of my Polish friends tell me that he's not the only Polish male, who has very little sympathy for the women's movement, then I'm still optimistic. And let me document this. It is interesting to look at about 6 or 7 American bishops have already written pastoral letters on women. And in these pastoral letters, they have picked up significant arguments from the women's movement. In particular, in these pastoral letters written by the American bishops, and the Canadian bishops produced a very wonderful document. Some of you might have seen this, a document which they submitted to the last Synod of Bishops in '83, in which they talk about women. They talk about the subjugation of women in the Church. They talk about the male chauvinism and so on, an extraordinary document. And so I see coming in the Church, emerging, a woman's movement backed by a significant number of bishops. And so I do think this will have eventually an influence. And so I'm really optimistic about this. And of course, once the women's questions are raised, all kinds of other sexual issues have to be raised, and all kinds of issues regarding ministry have to be raised. I don't think it's only a question of priesthood. It isn't only a question of priesthood, it's a question of ministry. That is, how much participation is there in ministry? Do you really want to divide the Church into priests and non-priests? Or do we rather think of the Church as in ministry, and this ministry is distributed in multiple ways, There is an ordained ministry, but there are also ordained ministry of different kinds, priests and deacons, and then there are other ministries which cooperate, and therefore we can think of a much more communitary way in which ministry is organized. And one must hope that the women's movement, as it gains power in cultural power in the church, will lead us away from the kind of a hierarchical imagination that we have inherited in the Catholic Church. In the Catholic Church, we have inherited an ecclesiastical thinking that makes us suppose that order is always guaranteed by a single linchpin that keeps everything under control. That is, we think of order as only possible under the authority of one person. There must be one male who keeps everything under control, and this is our image of order. And I think that this is really questioned by the women's movement. This is a kind of a penal imagination. That is, women argue that could one not imagine order that is based on cooperation and joint action and the distribution of authority? Could not different people exercise authority and they interact, and you can have order guaranteed and promoted without having a single male or a single person who is responsible? It doesn't have to be a one-man show. And I would think that one must really hope that this will take place, and as you can see immediately, this has theological implications, because of course there's also the imagination that the divinity is some sort of hyper male, some enormous bishop or super pope high above us who keeps everything under control. And if this is indeed our notion of the mystery of God, then we would be greatly misled into something that has very little to do with the biblical religion, because after all, we do believe in a mystery of God that is operative in and through us, and that is operative in our hearts and in our communities, both as judgment on the awful things we do and as the energy for new life, so that we can create among ourselves a more true humanity. So I do have hope. Are there other remarks, questions?
Doctor, I'm surprised to hear that the Pope and the Canadian bishops have put so much stock in the labor movement. If the weakness of the capitalist system is profit, I'm always disappointed to find how much our labor movement is motivated by profit also. And I wonder if that's not going to hinder that what we hope for, because they are so
yes.
profit motivated.
Let me analyze. I mean, interesting question. It is not the first time that I've heard it, no. First of all, the critique of capitalism of the Canadian bishops and of the Pope is not critical of profit as such. Because after all, we all know that if we have any business, there has to be some profit. They talk about the maximization of profit. In other words, they use the technical language. I think I quoted Pope John Paul II yesterday. He uses the technical language of the maximization of profit. And they argue that the logic of capitalism is the maximization of profit. The Globe and Mail also always hears them differently. And the Globe and Mail always says the bishops are criticizing profit. They don't. It seems to me common sense. If you have any kind of business, any farm or any industry, then it has to pay for itself, and there has to be a gain, there has to be a profit, because you have to renew the machinery, and you have to promote, and people have to live on it, and people have the right to live well on what they make. And therefore it's the maximization of profit that is criticized in the market system. And then you answer quite correctly that it can happen very often that in the labor movement can be so overwhelmed by capitalist mentality that they too strive for the maximization of profit. That certainly is possible. And therefore, if you read the Canadian Bishop Statement, I really recommend this. It's only 6 pages. It's really worthwhile, about 6 or 7 pages. It's really worthwhile to read it carefully. The Canadian bishops, therefore, don't simply stand behind the labor movement as it exists. I mean, that would be quite... they regard themselves as being non-partisan. That is, they don't identify themselves with any existing labor organization. They don't identify themselves with the NDP. In fact, in my commentary, if you will read it, I have shown exactly how they differ from the NDP and how they challenge the NDP and how they differ from the Canadian Labour Congress. I mean, it is not an identification with an existing organization. And therefore, they challenge the labor movement. And they argue that the labor movement that is faithful to its vocation must not confine its interest simply to improving its economic advantage, but ought to be in solidarity with the enormous sector of labor that is not organized. And as you know, both in the USA and Canada, especially in the USA, but also in Canada, organized labor is declining in strength. I mean, you have vast numbers of laborers are not organized, and mostly women are not organized, and very often non-white labor in the United States especially is not organized. And therefore you have, in a certain sense, you have at least 2 labor forces in our countries. You have organized labor in the large industries, and you have unorganized labors in smaller businesses, and therefore you have quite different labor movement, and therefore it is possible that the organized labor movement can limit its interest to itself and neglect the unorganized laborers and can neglect the unemployed. And therefore the bishops argue, I thought I wanted to say this, I should have been clearer, the bishops argue therefore for a movement of solidarity. And the movement of solidarity means that each of these groups that suffer in this country must in some sense modify their aims sufficiently to be in solidarity with all the other movements side by side, which also want a restructuring of the economy. And therefore I agree with you, it is possible for a labor union simply to fall into the logic of capitalism and use the collective bargaining to maximize their income, even though this hardly ever happens. I mean, one would have to go to each union. I would be willing to do this, to sit down for each union. I'm always afraid of generalization in this case. One has to go in each particular case. Very often the news, the information we get from the newspaper very often is insufficient to do this, because newspaper, as you know, are not very neutral when it comes to labor struggles, and therefore they don't give us enough information to judge a labor struggle. We really have to telephone the labor union, or have to telephone our friends who have more information to get statistics and so on. Very often we are told in the newspaper about the existing salaries of a particular, or wages of a particular group, and then we are told what they want. And when we inquire, we find that there is a great distribution of wages in a particular branch, or in a particular plant, or in a particular industrial outfit. And there may be some of the workers get this high wage, which is listed in the newspaper, but the majority of them get really very low wages. And so unless we make this telephone call and investigate, the newspapers don't inform us sufficiently to make a judgment. And therefore we, you know, in our cities and our home, we really have to take an interest in this. And therefore I agree with you, it is possible that, that labor groups can become overwhelmed by the capitalist spirit and seek to maximize their profit. And I would say the bishop's statement and the pope's statement really summons them to be faithful to the vocation of the labor movement, and that is to be in solidarity with all the other workers and all the other poor, and together in this solidarity movement work for the transformation, the structural change of our economy. And I emphasize the word structural change because this was the word that the bishops used, and this was the word that was repeated by Pope John Paul II at Flat Rock, Newfoundland. He had a bit of difficulties pronouncing it, and therefore I remember it very well. He was struggling around the word structural, and I know what it means to have difficulties occasionally pronouncing an English word. So he was struggling with structural. So this is, structural change in our economy. And so I want to emphasize then that this is not at all a kind of blind support of existing labor organizations, but the bishop's teaching and the papal teaching is challenging all sectors of society, including that of the labor movement.
question and comment by telling you that I have terrible positivist inclinations, which I don't seem to be able to purge myself of. In my reading of these matters, one of the beauties of millenarian dreams is that they tend to remain dreams. And this is demonstrated quite easily historically. I was kind of wondering, in terms of the leadership that's being suggested here, the leadership role of the church in terms of the social transformation, the economic transformation of our society, if indeed this millenarian dream is to come to bear, is the church prepared to pack up its tent and leave town? I don't know how I just don't understand, once the dream comes to bear, what the function of the of leadership remains after the fact.
I'm not totally certain.
In other words, it occurs to me that to a very great degree there's a vested interest in the perpetuation of no change in order to maintain the role of leadership.
Yeah. I mean, I hope I didn't create the impression that the churches wanted to exercise leadership and organize workers and be the main agent of social change in this country. I was talking in the wider context of social change, and I was trying to show that in the past, religions very often exercised a legitimating influence on culture. That is, religions were ideological. That is, religions were priestly in the sense that they blessed the existing order. And this was true in Europe, and this was true in North America, with a few exceptions. And I mentioned, for instance, the social gospel that was not legitimating religion, but prophetic or critical religion. And I was trying to say that what has taken place in the Christian church over the last 15 years is a shift. A shift has taken place from legitimating religion to prophetic religion. And in my lecture this morning, I tried to show that this is not a secular position that emerged. This is not a secular movement. This is a religious movement. And this morning I showed this is really connected with new religious experiences. And this is connected with a new reading of the scriptures. And I mentioned a transformist Christology. This is a new way of experiencing Jesus Christ as the one who changes us and through us changes the world. And I was trying to document that this new transformist understanding of Jesus Christ is found in the World Council of Churches, is found in the Canadian Council of Churches, is found in the document of the various Protestant churches, is found in the Catholic Church in recent documents. This is a significant shift that has taken place in religions. I was talking about this. However, society is not Christian. I mean, Canada is not a Christian country. Canada is a pluralistic country. There are many Christians in Canada, there are many Jews in Canada, there are members of other religions in Canada, and above all, there are secular people in Canada. And therefore, I don't understand at all this particular movement in the church as a movement of re-Christianization, or as some kind of movement that we want the whole world to be Christian again, or that the Pope John Paul II came to Canada to convert all of us to Catholicism. No. On the contrary, you remember when he arrived in Quebec, on the very first speech he made, he addressed Canada in its pluralism. And he said, in Canada, I want to greet the Catholic community, and then I want to greet the Protestant community, and I want to greet the members of the Jewish religion, I want to greet the members of other religions, and I want to greet the Canadians who define their ethical ideals without reference to God in a secular way. And he wanted to come and greet them, not to convert them all to Catholicism, but to greet them and to offer them their friendship and his friendship and his concern for justice. And therefore here is a vision of a pluralistic society where we are very much in need of ethical involvement, but each community, each group will make a contribution to this collective ethics out of their own past. And therefore Catholics will make a contribution to this out of their Catholic past. Presbyterians, Calvinists will make it out of their rereading of the Calvinist past. The Anglican, the Baptist, the other Christian churches do it out of their tradition. Jews do it out of theirs. There are secular ethical traditions, and people who are secular do this out of their ethical tradition. And so it's a summons to take seriously the roots from whence we come, a summons to take seriously our past, and to derive from our great moments of the past ethical principles that allows us to cooperate and to create a more just society. And therefore I would want to argue there's nothing millenarian about this. This is not some kind of some kind of a perfect society that is being proposed. No. It is rather argued that society at the moment makes many people suffer. With a certain amount of effort, society could become a little bit better, and fewer people could suffer in this society. And because there is a growing gap between rich and poor, and because millions of people are being maneuvered into slow death, there is a certain urgency to this. And for that reason, all the ethical communities, including all the churches, are increasingly worried about this ethical dimension. And again, I want to say something that I said already yesterday. In the Catholic Church in particular, the silence of the churches during fascism and the silence of Pius XII during the time when the Jewish people were mass murdered by Nazis, that this weighs on the church. And the church then was silent in the face of great social evil. And since that time, all the Christian churches, the Catholic Church in particular, has really changed. And therefore churches regard it as their sacred duty to speak out on injustices, not because they think they have the solution, not because they can, as you suggest, take the leadership, but because they believe fidelity to the gospel of Jesus demands of them to give public witness and be prophetic in this sense. And therefore, perhaps, maybe I speak with too much enthusiasm, and out of my enthusiasm you have thought that maybe we have the answer to all the difficulties of the economic system. I didn't want to do this. I just wanted to introduce the Catholic contribution to the economic debate, which I find enormously useful because it removes the taboo that has been cast by mainstream culture over many of these topics, because it allows us to criticize capitalism without immediately being called pinkos, and therefore I regard this as an enormously contribution to Canadian society.
I think I speak for most of us, if not all of us, when I say that I wish we could hang on to Gregory Baum for days and days and days. Gregory, on behalf of the entire university community and the Sisters of Charity in particular, it's my happy duty to express to you our deepest gratitude for an excellent series of lectures. You've not only challenged our minds, you've instilled in us some hope for a better society, actually, and you've shown us how deeply rooted in the gospel is the quest for social justice. And in the name of us all, I would like to express my and our gratitude for your doing this for us. Thank you very much, and we'll see you all next year.